You know that feeling when someone wants all the benefits of being with you, but none of the commitment? That was basically my entire relationship with Maya. She'd act like my girlfriend when it was convenient, then pull back whenever things got too real. I thought I was okay with this arrangement until one random Tuesday evening when everything changed. She saw a text from my female colleague pop up on my phone, and suddenly this woman who claimed she wasn't ready for anything serious turned into someone I barely recognized. The jealousy was instant and intense, and that's when I realized I'd been played this whole time. Sometimes it takes seeing someone's true colors to understand you've been living in their carefully constructed fantasy. So I'm Ethan, 27, graphic designer. I work at this mid-sized marketing agency downtown, and honestly, my life was pretty routine until Maya came along about 8 months ago. We met through mutual friends at some house party, and there was this immediate connection that felt different from anything I'd experienced before. Maya was this free-spirited artist type who worked part-time at a local gallery and spent most of her time on these abstract paintings that I never really understood but found fascinating anyway. She had this way of making everything feel spontaneous and exciting, like we were always on the verge of some great adventure. The thing is, from the very beginning, she made it clear that she wasn't looking for anything serious. She told me she was still figuring herself out and didn't want to be tied down to traditional relationship expectations. At first, I thought I was cool with that arrangement. We'd hang out a few times a week, spend weekends together, and basically act like a couple without any of the official labels or future planning. But as months went by, I started noticing these contradictions in her behavior. She'd get upset if I made plans without telling her, but then she'd disappear for days without explanation. She wanted me available whenever she needed emotional support, but she'd shut down whenever I tried to have deeper conversations about where we were heading. I kept telling myself this was just how modern dating worked, that I was being too traditional in my expectations. Looking back, I realized I was making excuses for someone who wanted to have their cake and eat it too. The conversation that started everything happened on a Thursday night in early March. I was at Maya's apartment, this tiny studio space she'd decorated with her artwork and random vintage furniture she'd found at thrift stores. We'd just finished watching some indie film she'd been excited about, and I was feeling particularly close to her that evening. I'd been thinking about our situation for weeks, and I finally decided to bring up the topic I'd been avoiding. I told her I'd been wondering where we stood and whether she'd given any more thought to making things more official between us. I wasn't asking for marriage or moving in together, just some acknowledgement that what we had was worth defining. Maya immediately got this uncomfortable look on her face and started fidgeting with the rings on her fingers. She told me she thought I understood that she wasn't ready for that kind of commitment yet. She said she was still working through some personal stuff and didn't want to make promises she couldn't keep. I asked her what kind of personal stuff she meant and whether there was a timeline for when she might feel ready. She got defensive and said she couldn't put a deadline on her emotional growth. She told me that pressuring her would only push her away and that she thought I was different from other guys who tried to rush things. That's when I realized I'd been walking on eggshells around this topic for months, afraid of seeming too needy or traditional. I told her I wasn't trying to pressure her, but that I also couldn't keep pretending I didn't want something more stable and defined. She softened a bit, then, and came over to sit closer to me on her couch. She said she really cared about me and didn't want to lose what we had, but that she just needed more time to figure things out. She asked if I could be patient with her process. I looked around her apartment, at all the evidence of this life she'd built that I was only partially included in, and something shifted in my perspective. I told her I understood her position, but that I also needed to be honest about my own needs. I said I couldn't keep investing emotionally in something that might never become what I was hoping for. The conversation ended with this awkward tension where we both acknowledged the problem, but neither of us had a solution. I decided to take a step back and give her the space she said she needed, but also to start protecting myself emotionally. I stopped initiating most of our conversations and plans, waiting to see how she'd respond to having more of the independence she claimed to want. Over the next couple of weeks, something interesting happened. Maya started reaching out more frequently than she had in months. She'd text me random things throughout the day, send me photos of stuff she was working on, and suggest hanging out way more often than usual. At first, I thought this was a positive sign that maybe she was reconsidering her stance on commitment. But then I noticed she'd also started asking these subtle questions about how I was spending my time when we weren't together. She'd ask if I had fun at work events or whether I'd done anything interesting over the weekend when we hadn't made plans. I found this behavior confusing because it seemed like she wanted to know about my life, while simultaneously maintaining that she wasn't ready for the kind of relationship where we'd naturally share those details. I started paying more attention to these contradictory signals she was sending. One day, I mentioned that I'd grabbed drinks with some colleagues after work, and she immediately wanted to know who was there and what we talked about. When I told her it was just a few people from my team, including Sarah, this woman who worked in account management, Maya got this weird look and asked follow-up questions about Sarah specifically. I explained that Sarah was just a work friend and that the whole group had been celebrating finishing a big project. Maya nodded but seemed distracted for the rest of our conversation. I started wondering if she was feeling jealous despite claiming she didn't want the kind of relationship where jealousy would be relevant. Another time, she showed up at my apartment unannounced on a Saturday afternoon, something she'd never done before. She said she was in the neighborhood and thought she'd see if I was around. When I told her I'd been planning to do some grocery shopping and errands, she offered to come with me, which was also completely out of character for her. During our grocery store trip, she was more affectionate than usual, holding my hand and making jokes about domestic life. But when an older woman in the checkout line made some comment about us being a cute couple, Maya immediately dropped my hand and got quiet. I was starting to feel like I was dating two different people. There was the Maya who wanted distance and independence, and then there was this other version who seemed possessive and clingy. I couldn't figure out what had triggered this change in her behavior, but I was becoming increasingly frustrated with the mixed messages. The whole situation was making me second-guess my decision to step back. Part of me wondered if her increased attention meant she was finally ready to have the conversation about commitment that I'd been wanting. But another part of me felt like she was just responding to the perceived threat of losing control over our dynamic rather than actually changing her feelings about what she wanted from me. The breaking point came on a Tuesday evening when Maya was over at my place. We'd ordered takeout and were watching something on Netflix when my phone buzzed with a text message. I glanced at it quickly and saw it was from Sarah, my colleague from work. The message was completely innocent, just something about a client meeting we had the next day, but Maya happened to see Sarah's name on my phone screen. The change in her demeanor was immediate and dramatic. She asked who Sarah was texting me so late in the evening, and I explained that it wasn't late, it was only 7:30, and that Sarah often sent work-related messages outside of office hours. Maya said she found it weird that a female colleague would be texting me about work stuff when we weren't at work. I told her that's just how modern workplaces operated and that Sarah and I had been collaborating on several projects lately. Maya wanted to know what kind of projects and how long I'd been working closely with Sarah. Her questions felt more like an interrogation than casual curiosity. When I asked Maya why she was so interested in my work relationships, she claimed she was just trying to understand my day-to-day life better. But her tone suggested something much more intense than friendly interest. I decided to test my theory about her jealousy by mentioning that Sarah and I had been grabbing coffee occasionally to discuss project strategies. Maya's reaction confirmed my suspicions. She wanted to know how often we got coffee, whether other people joined us, and what we talked about besides work. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on me. Here was someone who'd told me repeatedly that she wasn't ready for commitment, but she was acting possessive about my interactions with a female colleague. I pointed out this contradiction to Maya, asking her how she could be concerned about my friendships with other women when she'd made it clear she didn't want an exclusive relationship. Maya got defensive and said she wasn't being possessive, just curious. She claimed that wanting to know about my life didn't mean she was ready for commitment, and that I was reading too much into her questions. But I could see the jealousy in her eyes, and it was obvious that seeing another woman's name on my phone had triggered something in her. This was the same person who'd told me she needed space and independence, yet she was clearly uncomfortable with the idea that I might have meaningful connections with other women. I realized in that moment that Maya wanted to keep me in this limbo state where I was emotionally available to her whenever she needed me, but where she didn't have to reciprocate that availability or commitment. She wanted the security of knowing I was there without having to offer me the same security in return. The rest of that week, Maya's behavior became even more contradictory and demanding. She started texting me more frequently during work hours, something she'd rarely done before. When I didn't respond immediately, She'd send follow-up messages asking if I was busy or whether everything was okay. On Thursday, she suggested we grab lunch together, which meant she'd have to take time off from the gallery and meet me downtown. This was completely unlike her usual preference for keeping our lives separate during work hours. When I asked what prompted the sudden interest in lunch dates, she said she just missed me and wanted to see me more often. During lunch, she kept steering the conversation toward my work and specifically asked about Sarah again. She wanted to know what Sarah looked like, how old she was, and whether she was single. When I asked why these details mattered, Maya claimed she was just trying to get a better picture of my work environment. I told Maya that her sudden interest in my female colleagues felt intrusive, especially given that she'd established boundaries about not wanting to be too involved in each other's daily lives. She accused me of being defensive and said she was just trying to be a better friend by showing more interest in my world. The word bothered me because it felt like she was using it to justify her behavior while avoiding the responsibilities that would come with being a girlfriend. I asked her directly whether she considered us friends or something more, and she gave me this vague answer about how labels weren't important and that what mattered was how we felt about each other. But her actions suggested that she definitely saw us as more than friends when it came to her expectations of my behavior. She wanted to know about my interactions with other women. She wanted more of my time and attention, and she was acting territorial in ways that contradicted everything she'd said about wanting independence. On Saturday, she showed up at my apartment again without calling first. When I mentioned that I'd been planning to meet some friends for drinks later, she asked if she could come along. I told her that would be fine, but I was curious about her sudden interest in meeting my friends since she'd previously said she preferred to keep things casual between us. She said she was just feeling more social lately and thought it would be fun to get to know the people in my life better. But I suspected she was more interested in monitoring my interactions than in actually socializing. At the bar with my friends, Maya was charming and engaging, but I noticed she paid particular attention whenever I talked to women in the group. She'd position herself closer to me during those conversations and find ways to insert herself into the discussion. My friend Jake pulled me aside at one point and asked if Maya was my girlfriend because she was acting pretty possessive. I told him that was exactly the problem, that she wanted to act like my girlfriend when it suited her, but refused to commit to actually being my girlfriend. The following Tuesday, I decided I needed some outside perspective on the situation, so I met up with my friend Marcus at his place after work. Marcus had been in a similar situation a few years back, and I trusted his judgment about relationship dynamics. I explained the whole timeline to Marcus, from Maya's initial insistence that she wasn't ready for commitment to her recent possessive behavior around my female colleagues. Marcus listened without interrupting, occasionally nodding in recognition. When I finished explaining the situation, Marcus told me he thought Maya was trying to have it both ways. He said it sounded like she wanted the emotional security of knowing I was exclusively focused on her without having to offer me the same exclusivity in return. Marcus asked me whether I'd seen any evidence that Maya was dating other people during our time together. I realized I'd never actually asked her directly about that, and that her vague boundaries about independence could easily have included seeing other people. That possibility hadn't really occurred to me before, but it made sense given her reluctance to define our relationship. If she was keeping her options open romantically, then her jealousy about my female friendships was even more hypocritical than I'd realized. Marcus suggested that I needed to force the issue by setting some clear boundaries of my own. He said I could either accept that we were just casual friends with no expectations about exclusivity, or I could insist on having a real relationship with mutual commitment and transparency. He warned me that trying to maintain the current ambiguous situation would probably just lead to more frustration and confusion. Marcus told me that in his experience, people who refused to commit while acting possessive were usually trying to maintain control over the relationship dynamic. We talked about specific strategies for having this conversation with Maya. Marcus suggested that I be direct about what I wanted and equally direct about what I wasn't willing to accept. He said I should be prepared for her to accuse me of being unreasonable or demanding, but that I shouldn't let her turn the conversation into being about my expectations rather than about her contradictory behavior. Marcus also pointed out that Maya's recent increase in attention and possessiveness suggested that she was capable of prioritizing our relationship when she felt threatened. He said that proved she had the emotional capacity for commitment, but was choosing not to offer it when she felt secure about my availability. By the end of our conversation, I felt clearer about what I needed to do. I decided I would give Maya one more opportunity to have an honest conversation about what she wanted, but that I wouldn't continue accepting mixed messages and contradictory behavior. I realized I'd been so focused on not seeming demanding that I'd lost sight of my own legitimate needs and boundaries. Marcus reminded me that wanting clarity and consistency in a relationship wasn't unreasonable, and that I deserved to be with someone who was enthusiastic about being with me. That weekend, I decided to have the conversation I'd been avoiding. Maya came over on Saturday afternoon, and I could tell she was expecting our usual routine of hanging out without addressing any of the underlying tension between us. I told her I wanted to talk about what had been happening between us lately, specifically her increased interest in my interactions with other women despite her stated preference for keeping things undefined between us. Maya immediately got defensive and said she didn't know what I meant. She claimed she was just being friendly and interested in my life, and that I was making a big deal out of nothing. I brought up specific examples, like her questions about Sarah and her sudden desire to meet my friends and join me for activities she'd previously shown no interest in. I told her that her behavior seemed possessive and that it contradicted everything she'd said about wanting independence and space. Maya accused me of being paranoid and said that I was misinterpreting her attempts to be a better friend. She asked why I was so defensive about my female colleagues if there was nothing inappropriate happening. That question made me realize she was trying to flip the script and make me seem like the one with something to hide. I told her that I wasn't defensive about my friendships, but that I found it hypocritical for her to act jealous when she'd refused to commit to being in an actual relationship with me. I asked her directly whether she was seeing other people, and she got angry that I would even ask that question. She said that what she did in her free time was her own business, and that we'd never agreed to be exclusive. Her reaction told me everything I needed to know. I said that if we weren't exclusive, then she had no right to question my friendships with women or to act possessive about my time and attention. Maya said I was being unreasonable and that caring about someone didn't require formal labels or commitments. She accused me of trying to trap her into a relationship she'd been clear she wasn't ready for. I told her I wasn't trying to trap her into anything, but that I also wasn't going to continue accepting contradictory behavior. I said she needed to decide whether she wanted a casual friendship with no expectations or a committed relationship with mutual exclusivity and transparency. Maya said I was giving her an ultimatum and that ultimatums were manipulative. She claimed that real love didn't require forcing someone to make choices they weren't ready for. I explained that I wasn't trying to manipulate her, but that I couldn't keep investing emotionally in someone who wanted all the benefits of my commitment without offering any commitment in return. I told her that her recent behavior suggested she did want exclusivity, but only from me, not for me. Maya's response to my boundary setting was more explosive than I'd expected. She accused me of betraying the understanding we'd had about keeping things casual and flexible. She said I was trying to change the rules of our relationship without her consent. I reminded her that she was the one who'd changed the dynamic by becoming possessive and demanding more of my time and attention. I pointed out that casual relationships didn't typically include interrogating each other about friendships with the opposite sex. She started crying and said I was being cruel and that she'd thought I understood her need to take things slowly. She claimed that I was punishing her for starting to open up more and show more interest in my life. I felt guilty seeing her upset, but I also recognized that she was trying to manipulate the situation by making me feel bad for setting reasonable boundaries. I told her that I wasn't trying to punish her, but that I needed consistency in her behavior and honesty about what she wanted. Maya said she couldn't give me the kind of commitment I was asking for right now, but that she didn't want to lose me either. She asked if we could go back to how things were before, when we were both more relaxed about expectations. I explained that we couldn't go back because I now understood that our previous arrangement hadn't actually been working for me. I'd been suppressing my own needs to accommodate her preferences, and that wasn't sustainable long-term. At this point, Maya called her friend Jessica, who happened to be in the area, and asked her to come over. When Jessica arrived, Maya immediately started explaining her version of our conversation, portraying me as someone who was suddenly demanding commitment after months of agreeing to keep things casual. Jessica took Maya's side and told me that I was being unfair to change my expectations without warning. She said that Maya had been honest from the beginning about not wanting anything serious, and that I was wrong to pressure her now. I tried to explain the contradiction between Maya's stated preferences and her recent possessive behavior, but Jessica dismissed my concerns and said that caring about someone naturally led to wanting to know more about their life. Having Jessica there made the conversation much more difficult because Maya felt supported in her position and became even more resistant to acknowledging the validity of my perspective. I realized that Maya had called Jessica specifically to avoid having to deal with the conversation one-on-one. I told both of them that I wasn't trying to pressure Maya into anything she didn't want, but that I also couldn't continue in a relationship that was causing me frustration and confusion. I said Maya was free to make whatever choice felt right for her, but that I needed to make choices that felt right for me too. After Jessica left that evening, Maya and I sat in uncomfortable silence for a while. I could tell she was processing what had happened and trying to figure out how to respond to my ultimatum. Eventually, she asked me if I was really willing to throw away everything we'd built together over something she saw as a minor disagreement about boundaries. She said she felt like I was being dramatic and that most people our age were comfortable with more flexible relationship arrangements. I told her that what we'd built felt one-sided to me, and that flexibility shouldn't mean one person gets to set all the terms while the other person just accepts whatever they're offered. I explained that I'd been compromising my own needs for months, and that her recent behavior had made me realize how unsustainable that was. Maya said she didn't realize I'd been unhappy with our arrangement and that I should have spoken up sooner if I was feeling frustrated. She accused me of building up resentment instead of communicating openly about my concerns. There was some truth to her criticism, and I acknowledged that I probably should have addressed these issues earlier. But I also pointed out that every time I tried to have conversations about our relationship status, she'd shut them down or made me feel like I was being too demanding. She said she understood why I was frustrated, but that she still wasn't ready for the kind of commitment I was asking for. She asked if there was some middle ground where we could address my concerns without her having to make promises she wasn't sure she could keep. I asked her what kind of middle ground she had in mind, and she suggested that we could be more open about communication and that she could try to be less reactive when I mentioned other women in my life. But I realized that what she was offering was just a slight modification of the same basic arrangement that hadn't been working for me. She was still avoiding the fundamental question of whether she wanted to build something serious together or whether she preferred to keep her options open. I told her that I appreciated her willingness to compromise, but that I didn't think small adjustments would solve the underlying problem. I said I needed to be with someone who was excited about the possibility of building a future together, not someone who saw commitment as a burden to be avoided. Maya got quiet and said she needed some time to think about everything we discussed. She asked if we could take a break from seeing each other while she figured out what she wanted. I agreed to give her space, but I also told her that I wouldn't wait indefinitely for her to make up her mind. I said I was going to start focusing on other areas of my life and other relationships, and that she shouldn't expect me to remain available if she decided she wanted to try again later. The break from Maya lasted about 3 weeks, during which I focused on work, spent more time with friends, and started putting myself back out there socially. I realized how much energy I'd been putting into trying to decode Maya's mixed signals and how much mental space that had been taking up. During this time, I got closer to some colleagues, including Sarah, who turned out to be dealing with her own complicated relationship situation. We started grabbing coffee more regularly and became genuine friends, which made me realize how natural and uncomplicated healthy relationships could be. Maya eventually reached out and asked if we could meet to talk. She said she'd been thinking about our conversation and wanted to see if we could work things out. When we met for coffee, she told me she'd realized that she did have stronger feelings for me than she'd been willing to admit. She said she'd been scared of commitment because of some bad experiences in previous relationships, but that losing me had made her reconsider her priorities. I appreciated her honesty, but I also realized that I'd moved on emotionally during our time apart. The drama and confusion of our relationship seemed less appealing now that I'd remembered what it felt like to have straightforward, honest connections with people. I told Maya that I was glad she'd gained some clarity about her feelings, but that I didn't think we were compatible in terms of what we wanted from relationships. I said I'd learned that I needed to be with someone who was enthusiastic about commitment rather than someone who had to be convinced or pressured into it. Maya was disappointed, but said she understood my decision. She asked if we could remain friends, and I told her that might be possible eventually, but that I needed more time and distance first. Looking back, I think the whole experience taught me a lot about recognizing manipulation and mixed messages in relationships. Maya wasn't necessarily a bad person, but she wanted to control the terms of our relationship in a way that didn't account for my needs or feelings. I also learned that I needed to trust my instincts when something felt off, rather than trying to rationalize away my concerns to keep the peace. The jealousy Maya showed over my female friendships was a clear sign that she wanted more commitment than she was willing to offer, and I should have addressed that contradiction much earlier. Epilogue. These days, I'm in a much healthier relationship with someone who was excited about commitment from the beginning. We were able to have conversations about exclusivity and future plans without drama or mixed messages, which made me realize how exhausting my situation with Maya had been. I occasionally see Maya around town since we have mutual friends, and she seems to be doing well. She's dating someone new, and from what I've heard, she was much more direct about wanting a serious relationship with him, which suggests that her issues with commitment were specific to our situation rather than a general pattern. Sometimes I wonder if I gave up on Maya too quickly, especially since she eventually seemed ready to commit. But I think I made the right choice in prioritizing my own emotional well-being and refusing to accept a relationship dynamic that felt one-sided and manipulative. The whole experience taught me the importance of recognizing when someone's actions don't match their words, and of trusting my own perceptions even when someone tries to convince me that I'm being unreasonable. I'm grateful for the lessons I learned, even though the process of learning them was pretty frustrating at the time.